You wake up before dawn, not because someone told you to, because sleeping past first light is already a failure. You are 12 years old. You have been living in your teacher's household for several months now. You do not train with a sword yet. You sweep floors. You carry water. You watch. And you wait. This is not a story about glory. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Because the life of a samurai apprentice in feudal Japan was not built on combat. It was built on something far harder to learn: complete submission to a standard you had no say in setting. Not everyone became a samurai apprentice. The samurai were a hereditary warrior class, and by the later feudal period, particularly the Edo period, from the early 1600s onward, the system had become quite rigid. If you were born into a samurai family, a future in service was expected of you. If you were not, crossing into that world was extremely difficult and became increasingly rare over time. Most boys who entered formal training came from samurai households of varying rank. Some families had real power and land. Others were low-ranking samurai who had little more than the title and the right to carry a sword. Where your family sat in that hierarchy mattered enormously. It shaped where you trained, who trained you, and what kind of future was actually available to you. Typically, serious apprenticeship under a master or within a domain school began somewhere between the ages of 7 and 15, depending on the period and the tradition. You were not handed over to a stranger. In many cases, your teacher had a direct relationship with your family, your lord, or your clan. This was not a school in the modern sense. It was entry into a household, a lineage, and a set of obligations. Forget your old home. This household is your life. You lived under the roof of your teacher or within a training compound, and every part of the day was structured. You were expected to observe everything and complain about nothing. The hierarchy inside the household was strict and visible. Senior students sat higher at meals. They spoke first. You learned by watching them before you were ever taught directly. Your responsibilities in the early stages were domestic and menial: cleaning the training hall, preparing equipment, running errands, helping with meals. Some historians and traditional accounts describe apprentices performing years of domestic service before advancing to physical training, though the exact timeline varied by school, region, and era. This was deliberate. The idea was not to humiliate you. It was to test whether you had the temperament to submit completely before being trusted with anything dangerous. A student who resented the floor sweeping was not yet ready for the sword. Patience, silence, and steady effort were qualities the training was designed to produce from the very beginning. You were also being watched constantly. How you moved, how you spoke to seniors, whether you ate too quickly, whether you complained about the cold. Nothing was neutral. Every small act was part of your formation. When physical training began, it was not glamorous. The early work was about the body, posture, footwork, breathing, repetition. In many traditions, you would practice a single stance or a single movement hundreds of times before moving to the next. Barken, wooden swords, were used long before you ever touched a live blade. And in some schools, you trained with a wooden sword for years. This was not unusual. The barken was not a toy. A strike from a hardwood practice sword could break bones, and training accidents were real. But it also reflected the philosophy. Mastery of the form came before mastery of the weapon. Alongside swordsmanship, you were trained in other disciplines. Archery, horseback riding, and spear techniques were part of the traditional warrior curriculum. Later periods added additional emphasis on etiquette, calligraphy, Confucian study, and cultural refinement, particularly during the more peaceful Edo period, when actual combat was rare and samurai were increasingly expected to function as educated administrators and officials, not just fighters. The intellectual and cultural side of training is something modern depictions often skip over. But by the time of the Edo period, a samurai apprentice might spend as many hours studying classical texts and practicing formal riding as he did in the training hall. The ideal was not just a skilled warrior. It was a cultivated man who happened to be capable of violence when required. Bushido is a word people use today as if it were a clear rulebook handed to every apprentice on day one. The reality is more complicated. The concept of a formal samurai code developed gradually over centuries and was articulated most clearly in philosophical and literary writings, some of which were composed relatively late in the samurai tradition. Different domains, different schools, and different eras had different values and priorities. What remained consistent was a general emphasis on loyalty, duty, self-discipline, and the acceptance of death as a reality of your role. That last point was not abstract. You were expected to understand, from a young age, that your life was in service of something beyond yourself, your lord, your clan, your family's honor. The concept of dying well was discussed seriously, not as a celebration of death, but as a preparation for the possibility that duty might require the ultimate sacrifice. You were also expected to manage your emotions without suppressing your capacity for action. Fear was not something you announced. Anger was not something you displayed carelessly, but you were not being trained to be emotionless. You were being trained to be controlled. This created a particular kind of pressure that is hard to explain to someone who grew up in a different system. You were always being measured against an ideal that was never fully reachable, and you were expected to keep striving toward it anyway. Cold mornings, hard floors, early rising, long repetitions, silences that lasted for hours. The food was simple. In most warrior households, especially among lower-ranking samurai, meals were plain and practical. Rice was central where it was available. Excessive comfort was viewed with suspicion. A student who needed softness to function was considered poorly formed. You had almost no private life. The household schedule governed when you slept, when you ate, when you trained, and when you studied. Personal desires were largely irrelevant to the daily structure. If you had a disagreement with a senior student, you absorbed it. If the training hall was freezing in winter, you trained anyway. Serious injuries were part of the life. Bruises from sparring were routine. More serious injuries happened. Medical care in the modern sense did not exist. Recovery was expected to be quiet and uncomplaining. Social life outside the household was limited, particularly in the early stages of training. Your identity was increasingly defined by your school, your teacher, and your lord. The relationships you built within that world were the ones that would shape your entire future. Here is the part many people do not expect. By the later feudal period, and especially during the long peace of the Edo era, the role of the samurai had shifted significantly. Japan was not at constant war. Many samurai never fought in actual combat. Their function became increasingly administrative, ceremonial, and civic. A career in service might mean managing domain records, overseeing local governance, or serving in a formal household role, not leading charges on a battlefield. This was not a failure. It was the reality of the system. You trained for combat readiness, but the expectation of that readiness was itself the point. Whether combat ever came was not something you controlled, and rank still mattered enormously. A low-ranking samurai apprentice, no matter how disciplined or skilled, had a ceiling imposed by birth. In most cases, you could not simply outwork your way into a higher station. There were exceptions, particularly in periods of social upheaval or war, but the Edo system was notably rigid. You could become an excellent version of the role available to you, but changing that role fundamentally was rarely possible. The life of a samurai apprentice was not the sword. It was everything that came before the sword was ever earned. It was years of silence and cold mornings and domestic labor and watching your seniors and swallowing the things you wanted to say. It was a system that demanded total commitment to an ideal before it offered anything in return, and sometimes even after it did. What made this life hard was not the training. It was the expectation that you would internalize the standard so completely that you stopped needing to be told. That discipline would become something you carried in your body, not something you performed when watched. And what is most misunderstood about it is how much of that life happened in peacetime, in quiet, in the ordinary daily rhythms of a household, not on any battlefield. The sword was real, but the life built around it was built from far quieter things.